April 28, 1945. A woman who had never held political office, never commanded troops, and never made military decisions found herself facing a partisan firing squad in northern Italy. Clara Petacci's only crime, according to her executioners, was love. But the circumstances of her death would raise questions that historians are still debating nearly 8 decades later. What happened in those final moments wasn't just the elimination of a dictator's companion. It was a decision made in haste that would expose the complex moral boundaries of wartime justice, the power of personal vendettas, and the dangerous precedent of guilt by association during times of political upheaval. The speed of her execution, just hours after her capture, bypassed every principle of justice that the resistance movement claimed to represent. No trial, no evidence of personal wrongdoing, no consideration of her civilian status. Just a quick decision that would haunt the consciences of some participants for the rest of their lives. What you're about to discover challenges everything you thought you knew about justice, loyalty, and the price of love during one of history's darkest periods. This isn't just the story of how a woman died. It's the story of how political movements can lose their moral compass when faced with the intoxicating prospect of absolute power over life and death. Clara Petacci was born into a world of privilege and ambition that would ultimately seal her fate. The daughter of Dr. Francesco Saverio Petacci, a respected physician who had connections throughout Roman society, Clara grew up in an environment where political power and social status were intertwined in ways that seemed natural and inevitable. Her family's rise through Italian society during the 1920s and 1930s coincided perfectly with Mussolini's consolidation of power, and the Petacci household became increasingly connected to the fascist regime through a combination of genuine political support and calculated social climbing. Francesco Petacci used his medical practice and social connections to build relationships with fascist officials, while Clara's mother, Giuseppina Persichetti, cultivated friendships with the wives of prominent regime figures. Clara herself was everything that Mussolini found irresistible in women: young, beautiful, cultured, and completely devoted to his vision of Italian greatness. When they first met in 1932, she was just 20 years old, while he was approaching 50 and already showing signs of the physical and mental deterioration that would characterize his later years. Her youth and vitality seemed to reinvigorate him in ways that his wife Rachele could no longer provide. What made Clara particularly dangerous to those around Mussolini was not her political influence. She rarely involved herself directly in policy decisions, but her emotional influence over a man whose psychological stability was increasingly fragile. By the late 1930s, Mussolini was making crucial decisions while under the influence of various medications and stimulants, and Clara's presence had become one of the few constants that could calm his frequent outbursts and paranoid episodes. The relationship that developed between them went far beyond the typical arrangement between a powerful man and his mistress. Clara had become Mussolini's confidant, his emotional anchor, and the person to whom he revealed his deepest fears about Italy's future and his own legacy. She knew details about military operations, diplomatic negotiations, and political conspiracies that made her one of the most informed, non-official persons in fascist Italy. Her knowledge of state secrets was compounded by her family's increasing involvement in regime activities. Her brother Marcello had become a key figure in fascist propaganda operations, while her sister Miriam had married into a family with extensive connections to German intelligence services. The Petacci family had evolved from medical professionals and social climbers into a network of individuals with intimate knowledge of the regime's most sensitive operations. By 1943, Clara had established herself in a villa on Rome's Via del Camia that had become an unofficial center of power within the fascist hierarchy. Foreign diplomats, military commanders, and party officials regularly visited her residence to gauge Mussolini's mood and intentions through conversations with the woman who had unprecedented access to his private thoughts and fears. Her position had also made her extremely wealthy through a combination of official gifts, business opportunities that were provided by grateful officials, and investments that were guided by inside information about government policies and military plans. By the time Italy entered the war, Clara had accumulated enough assets to live independently of Mussolini if she had chosen to do so. But her emotional attachment to Mussolini had become so complete that the possibility of abandoning him during his decline was never seriously considered. Even as the war turned against Italy and the regime began to collapse, Clara remained convinced that their relationship was more important than her personal safety or her family's welfare. Her decision to stay with Mussolini as his world crumbled around him was influenced by a romantic idealization of their relationship that blinded her to the political realities that would ultimately determine her fate. She seemed to believe that love could somehow transcend the brutal calculations of wartime politics, and that her loyalty would be recognized and respected even by Mussolini's enemies. But the forces gathering against the fascist regime had no interest in romantic gestures or personal loyalty. They saw Clara Petacci not as a woman in love, but as a symbol of the corruption and decadence that had characterized fascist rule, and her elimination would send a powerful message about the comprehensive nature of their victory over everything the regime had represented. As events moved toward their climax in April 1945, Clara's fate was being determined not by her own actions or decisions, but by political calculations that had reduced her to a symbol rather than recognizing her as a human being with rights and dignity that should have been protected regardless of her personal relationships. The decision to accompany Mussolini during his attempted escape to Switzerland was the choice that would transform Clara Petacci from a protected civilian into a target for elimination. As the fascist regime collapsed around them in April 1945, she had multiple opportunities to separate herself from Mussolini and seek safety through her family's connections or her own resources. But her emotional attachment overruled every rational consideration. The escape convoy that departed from Milan on April 25th included German SS officers, fascist officials, and their families. But Clara's presence created complications that none of the other participants had anticipated. Unlike the wives and companions of other officials, who were generally ignored by partisan forces as non-combatants, Clara had become too closely identified with Mussolini's regime to be treated as an innocent bystander. Her insistence on remaining with Mussolini despite warnings from his security detail that her presence would make the group more conspicuous and harder to hide demonstrated a complete misunderstanding of how partisan justice operated during the final weeks of the war. The resistance movement had evolved beyond targeting just official figures to eliminating anyone whose continued existence might serve as a rallying point for fascist sympathizers. The convoy's route through increasingly hostile territory exposed them to partisan checkpoints where Clara's recognition could have compromised the entire escape attempt. Her face had been featured in newspaper photographs and newsreels throughout Italy for over a decade, making her one of the most recognizable women in the country, and creating security problems that the group's limited resources couldn't address effectively. As they traveled north toward the Swiss border, Clara's behavior revealed a disconnect from reality that had been developing throughout the war years. She seemed to believe that her relationship with Mussolini provided her with some form of diplomatic immunity that would be respected even by his enemies, and her conversations with other convoy members suggested that she expected to be treated as a non-combatant if they were captured. The other women in the convoy, who were more realistic about their situation, had prepared false documents and cover stories that might provide them with protection if they were separated from their husbands and companions. Clara, however, had made no such preparations and seemed to believe that honesty about her identity would somehow work in her favor with partisan forces. Her presence also created emotional complications for Mussolini that affected his decision-making during critical moments of the escape attempt. His concern for her safety led him to reject several opportunities to separate from the main convoy and attempt individual escape through routes that might have been successful for a single person, but were impossible for a couple traveling together. The psychological dynamics between Clara and Mussolini during these final days revealed how completely their relationship had become detached from political and military realities. They functioned as a couple focused on their personal bond, rather than as individuals capable of making rational decisions about survival in an extremely dangerous situation. When the convoy was finally stopped at the partisan checkpoint near Dongo on April 27th, Clara's reaction to the capture demonstrated her fundamental misunderstanding of partisan attitudes toward collaborators and regime supporters. She apparently expected to be questioned and released, possibly after some form of administrative processing that would allow her to continue her journey to neutral territory. The partisan soldiers who conducted the initial interrogation were struck by her apparent belief that her civilian status and lack of official political role would protect her from the fate that awaited the male members of the convoy. Her responses to their questions suggested that she genuinely believed that being in love with Mussolini was not a political crime that merited serious punishment. But the local partisan commanders, who made the initial decisions about the convoy's fate, understood that Clara's symbolic value to the resistance movement might be even greater than her practical importance. Her elimination would demonstrate that the new Italy had no tolerance for any aspect of the fascist regime, including the personal relationships that had supported and humanized the dictatorship. As the hours passed and the convoy members were separated for individual interrogation, Clara began to understand that her situation was far more serious than she had initially believed. But by that time, forces had already been set in motion that would make her fate inseparable from Mussolini's, regardless of any legal or moral arguments that might have been made for treating her as a non-combatant. The speed with which events moved after their capture left no time for the kind of careful consideration that might have saved her life, and the arrival of representatives from higher resistance authorities would bring orders that had already determined her fate before any local commanders had the opportunity to consider alternative approaches to her case. The arrival of Walter Audizio and his team from Milan on the evening of April 27th brought with it a set of instructions that would fundamentally alter Clara Petacci's chances of survival. The orders carried by the man calling himself Colonel Valerio were explicit about Mussolini's fate, but deliberately ambiguous about the treatment of other convoy members, creating a situation where local decisions would determine who lived and who died. What made Audizio's orders particularly ominous for Clara was their emphasis on speed and finality rather than justice or intelligence gathering. The resistance leadership in Milan had apparently decided that symbolic impact was more important than legal procedures, and they wanted dramatic results that could be publicized quickly to maximize their propaganda value throughout Italy. The local partisan commanders who received these orders found themselves in an extraordinarily difficult position regarding Clara's fate. She was clearly not a military target or a political leader, but her relationship with Mussolini had made her such a prominent symbol of fascist corruption that her survival might undermine the resistance movement's credibility with its own supporters. Audizio's team included individuals whose attitudes toward women associated with fascist officials were shaped by years of brutal warfare and personal experiences of occupation, collaboration, and betrayal. For these men, Clara represented not just Mussolini's mistress, but the entire class of privileged women who had benefited from fascist policies, while ordinary Italians suffered under dictatorship and war. The decision-making process that determined Clara's fate took place during a series of hurried consultations between Audizio and the local partisan leadership, but the conversations were conducted in ways that prevented most participants from understanding the full scope of what was being planned. The compartmentalization of information meant that many people who played roles in subsequent events were unaware of the broader context of their actions. What emerged from these discussions was a decision that Clara's fate would be linked directly to Mussolini's, based on the argument that separating them would create complications for the post-execution disposal of bodies and the coordination of public announcements about the resistance's victory over fascism. This practical consideration effectively sealed her death warrant, without any examination of legal or moral justifications for her execution. The speed of the decision-making process also prevented any consultation with higher resistance authorities who might have had different perspectives on the treatment of civilian women associated with regime figures. The orders from Milan had created a situation where immediate action was required, leaving no time for the kind of careful deliberation that might have saved Clara's life. Local partisan commanders later reported feeling uncomfortable with the inclusion of Clara in the execution orders, but the pressure to comply with instructions from higher authorities and the chaotic conditions of the final weeks of war made questioning these orders seem like insubordination rather than appropriate moral concern. The most disturbing aspect of the decision-making process was the apparent assumption that Clara's emotional attachment to Mussolini had somehow transformed her from a civilian into a legitimate military target. This reasoning represented a dangerous expansion of partisan justice beyond its original scope of targeting actual war criminals and collaborators. The orders also included specific instructions for the handling of Clara's body after the execution, suggesting that her death had been planned as an integral part of the propaganda operation, rather than as an unfortunate necessity. The detailed planning for post-execution procedures indicated that her elimination was seen as politically valuable rather than legally justified. As the evening of April 27th progressed, Clara was informed that she would be moved with Mussolini to a different location for their safety, but the true purpose of this transfer was concealed from her until the final moments. The deception used to secure her cooperation demonstrated the executioner's awareness that she was not a willing participant in her own destruction. The psychological impact on the local partisans who were required to participate in preparations for Clara's execution created tensions and moral conflicts that would persist long after the war ended. Several participants later reported having serious doubts about the justice of including a civilian woman in what was supposed to be a military operation against war criminals. But the momentum of events and the authority of the orders from Milan had created a situation where individual moral concerns were overwhelmed by organizational pressure and the demands of political expediency. Clara's fate had been determined by forces beyond her control and understanding, and the final hours before her execution would provide no opportunity for appeal or reconsideration. The night of April 27th marked Clara Petacci's final hours of life, though she remained largely unaware of what had been decided about her fate. The conditions of her detention were arranged to maintain the fiction that she and Mussolini were being held for their protection rather than for execution, and her conversations with guards and other prisoners suggested that she still believed some form of negotiated release might be possible. Clara's behavior during these final hours provided insight into the psychological mechanisms that had allowed her to maintain her attachment to Mussolini, despite the obvious dangers of their situation. She seemed to exist in a state of emotional denial that prevented her from recognizing the severity of their circumstances and the impossibility of escape from partisan justice. Her interactions with the guards assigned to watch her revealed a person who had become so accustomed to her privileged position that she couldn't comprehend how completely her situation had changed. She made requests for basic comforts and courtesies that demonstrated her continued expectation that she would be treated according to her previous social status, rather than as a prisoner awaiting execution. The psychological preparation required for her execution created serious problems for some of the partisan personnel who were assigned to carry out the operation. Unlike Mussolini, who could be viewed as a legitimate military target, Clara's civilian status and obvious vulnerability created moral conflicts that several participants found difficult to resolve. Local partisan commander Pier Luigi Bellini del Stella later reported struggling with the decision to include Clara in the execution, but the pressure from higher authorities and the fear of being accused of weakness or fascist sympathies prevented him from advocating for her separate treatment. The political climate of the final weeks of war made any show of mercy toward regime figures extremely dangerous for resistance leaders. Clara's requests to speak with religious officials or to send messages to her family were denied, ostensibly for security reasons, but actually to prevent any complications that might arise from external intervention in the execution plans. The isolation imposed on her during her final hours ensured that no one outside the immediate group of executioners would have the opportunity to advocate for her survival. The morning of April 28th brought the final phase of preparations for an execution that had been planned with careful attention to symbolic impact rather than legal justification. Clara was informed that she and Mussolini would be transferred to a safer location, and her apparent relief at this news demonstrated how completely she had misunderstood the intentions of her captors. The journey to the execution site at Villa Belmonte near Giulino di Mezzegra was conducted in a manner designed to prevent Clara from understanding what was about to happen until the final moments. The location had been chosen for its isolation and its symbolic significance as a site where fascist officials had previously detained and mistreated resistance fighters. During the transport, Clara's conversation with her guards focused on practical concerns about their destination and the expected duration of their stay, suggesting that she continued to believe that some form of imprisonment or house arrest was the most likely outcome of their capture. Her questions about food, clothing, and communication with the outside world indicated a person preparing for extended detention rather than imminent death. The final preparations at the execution site were conducted with efficiency that suggested extensive prior planning, but the inclusion of Clara in these preparations created logistical and psychological complications that the planners had not fully anticipated. Several participants later reported feeling uncomfortable with the methodical nature of arrangements for executing a civilian woman. Clara's realization of what was about to happen came only in the final minutes before the execution, when the true nature of their situation became impossible to conceal. Her reaction to this discovery provided evidence of the complete disconnect between her expectations and the political realities that had determined her fate. The speed with which the execution was carried out prevented any opportunity for last-minute intervention or reconsideration, and the predetermined nature of the proceedings made clear that Clara's fate had been decided by people who viewed her not as an individual human being, but as a symbol that needed to be eliminated for political purposes. Her final moments were witnessed by partisan personnel who later reported being troubled by the contrast between the careful planning that had gone into the operation and the apparent lack of consideration for the legal and moral implications of executing a civilian woman whose only crime had been her emotional attachment to Italy's former dictator. The execution of Clara Petacci on April 28, 1945, was carried out with a speed and efficiency that left no time for the kind of formal proceedings that might have provided legal justification for her death. The operation was conducted according to predetermined plans that treated her elimination as a necessary component of the broader symbolic victory over fascism, rather than as an act of individual justice. Walter Audizio's approach to Clara's execution revealed the extent to which the operation was being directed by political considerations rather than military necessity. Instead of conducting any form of interrogation that might have provided valuable intelligence about remaining fascist networks or hidden assets, the focus was entirely on completing the executions as quickly as possible to maximize their propaganda impact. The location chosen for the execution had been selected specifically for its isolation and symbolic significance, but the arrangements made for Clara's death demonstrated a level of advanced planning that went far beyond what would have been necessary for a spontaneous act of partisan justice. The positioning, timing, and documentation of her execution followed protocols that suggested extensive prior coordination. Clara's behavior during the final moments before her execution provided evidence of her continued inability to comprehend the political forces that had determined her fate. Her attempts to appeal for mercy or to explain her civilian status suggested that she still believed that reason and humanity might prevail over the demands of political symbolism. The decision to execute Clara alongside Mussolini, rather than separately, was made for practical and symbolic reasons that had nothing to do with her individual culpability or the legal justification for her death. The coordination of their executions was designed to create maximum visual and emotional impact when the news was announced to the Italian people and the international community. The partisan personnel assigned to carry out Clara's execution included individuals who later reported having serious reservations about the inclusion of a civilian woman in what was supposed to be a military operation against war criminals. However, the pressure to follow orders and the fear of being accused of fascist sympathies prevented these concerns from influencing the execution of the predetermined plan. The technical aspects of Clara's execution were handled with the same methodical efficiency that characterized Mussolini's death, but several witnesses later reported that the killing of a civilian woman created a different psychological atmosphere that made the entire operation feel more like murder than justice. The contrast between the careful planning and the obvious moral problems created lasting conflicts for some participants. The immediate aftermath of Clara's execution revealed the extent to which her death had been planned as an integral part of a broader propaganda operation rather than as an isolated act of justice. The arrangements for the transportation and display of her body had been prepared in advance, indicating that her elimination had been seen as politically necessary rather than legally justified. The documentation of Clara's execution through photographs and witness accounts was conducted according to predetermined protocols that suggested the operation had been planned by people with extensive experience in managing public reactions to political violence. The careful attention to visual details indicated that the psychological impact of her death had been considered at least as important as its immediate practical effects. The speed with which Clara's body was prepared for transport to Milan demonstrated the priority that had been placed on creating a dramatic public spectacle, rather than allowing time for any legal or religious procedures that might have been appropriate for the execution of a civilian. The efficiency of these arrangements indicated institutional rather than individual planning. Local partisan commanders who witnessed Clara's execution later reported being surprised by the methodical nature of the proceedings and the obvious advance preparation that had gone into every aspect of the operation. The level of coordination suggested involvement by organizations with resources and capabilities that went far beyond those of local resistance groups. The elimination of Clara Petacci was accomplished without any of the formal procedures that were supposed to govern partisan justice, and her death was treated as a necessary component of the broader victory over fascism rather than as an individual legal case that required specific justification. The precedent established by her execution would have lasting implications for the treatment of civilian women associated with defeated political movements. The psychological impact on witnesses to Clara's execution created moral conflicts that would persist long after the war ended, and several participants later expressed regret about their involvement in the killing of a woman whose primary crime had been her emotional attachment to Italy's former dictator. These concerns were suppressed at the time by political pressure and the demands of wartime solidarity. The transportation of Clara Petacci's body to Milan was conducted according to plans prepared well in advance, indicating her death had been viewed as a necessary component of a broader propaganda operation. The decision to display her body alongside Mussolini's at Piazzale Loreto was made for symbolic reasons that had nothing to do with her individual actions. The visual impact was intended to demonstrate complete victory over every aspect of the fascist regime. The preparation and positioning of Clara's body was calculated to create specific emotional responses among different audiences, from resistance supporters seeking confirmation of victory to fascist sympathizers being warned about consequences of continued loyalty. The crowd that gathered included individuals organized by various political groups to ensure public reaction would support their post-war objectives. International press coverage was carefully coordinated to ensure specific images reached global audiences, while others were suppressed. Several witnesses reported seeing individuals documenting the event for purposes unrelated to journalism, systematically recording public reactions in ways that suggested ongoing intelligence-gathering operations. The contrast between careful planning of Clara's display and the complete absence of legal procedures for her execution demonstrated that her death had been driven by political considerations rather than justice. The attention paid to maximizing propaganda value of her corpse stood in stark contrast to minimal consideration given to legal or moral justification for her execution. The psychological impact on viewers was more complex than resistance leadership expected. While fascist supporters were intimidated, many ordinary Italians were disturbed by the treatment of a civilian woman and began questioning whether the resistance movement had maintained its moral authority during its transition to political power. The images created during Clara's display would continue influencing Italian political culture for decades, but not as her executioners anticipated. Rather than serving as a warning about fascist collaboration, the spectacle became evidence of excessive brutality that characterized partisan justice during the war's final weeks. The immediate aftermath revealed significant divisions within the resistance movement about the legal and moral justification for Clara's death. While carried out according to predetermined plans, many participants began questioning whether eliminating a civilian woman had been necessary or appropriate. Official explanations were carefully crafted to avoid acknowledging that her death had been determined by political considerations rather than legal evidence. Walter Odizio's subsequent accounts contained significant inconsistencies about the decision-making process, raising questions about whether her death had been authorized by legitimate resistance leadership. International observers raised questions about the treatment of civilian women that would contribute to post-war international humanitarian law development. Vatican officials expressed private concerns about executing a woman who had not been formally charged, while Allied authorities found her execution problematic because it contradicted legal principles they were implementing throughout liberated Europe. Several participants later reported psychological problems related to their involvement in killing a civilian woman. The legal precedent was particularly troubling, because it suggested emotional relationships with political figures could be treated as crimes worthy of death, expanding partisan justice beyond targeting actual war criminals. The systematic suppression of detailed information about Clara's execution, including document destruction and witness intimidation, indicated ongoing concern about long-term political consequences. The absence of any formal trial meant no official record existed of charges that might have justified her execution. The broader pattern of executions during the war's final weeks, including other civilian women associated with fascist officials, suggested Clara's death was part of systematic policy rather than isolated incident. This created a moral debt that would continue troubling Italian society long after the immediate political objectives had been achieved. International legal experts found it difficult to identify any established principles that would have justified her execution. Her civilian status, absence of formal charges, and lack of evidence for personal war crimes. Participation made her death appear motivated by political expediency rather than legal justice. The legacy of Clara's execution serves as a permanent reminder of how easily political movements can lose their moral compass when acquiring power to determine life and death. Her death represents not just individual elimination, but corruption of a movement that began with legitimate claims to represent justice and democracy. The execution of Clara Petacci on April 28, 1945, represents one of the most morally troubling episodes in fascist Italy's final collapse. What happened to her reveals how easily political symbolism can override basic principles of justice, legal procedure, and human decency during revolutionary change. Clara's death was not the result of careful legal deliberation or evidence of wrongdoing. It was the product of hasty decisions by people who viewed her elimination as politically necessary rather than legally justified. The speed of her execution, without trial or formal charges, violated every principle of justice the resistance movement claimed to represent. The circumstances demonstrate how personal relationships can become political weapons during upheaval, and how symbolic value can override considerations of actual culpability. Clara's crime was not specific actions, but emotional attachment to a man whose regime had become politically unacceptable. The systematic planning that went into her execution reveals her death was viewed as integral to a propaganda operation, rather than an unfortunate consequence of her association with Mussolini. The political calculation reduced her from a human being with rights to a symbol that needed elimination. The long-term consequences extended far beyond her individual fate to influence international humanitarian law development, post-war Italian political culture, and our understanding of moral boundaries governing political movements during transitions. Her death serves as a cautionary example of how revolutionary justice can become indistinguishable from revenge when operating without legal constraints. The questions raised remain relevant today as societies struggle with political transition challenges, treatment of defeated opponents, and civilian population protection during conflict. Her story reminds us that methods used to achieve political objectives are often more important than the objectives themselves in determining political movements' long-term legitimacy. The moral debt created by Clara's execution could never be repaid because it represented fundamental human dignity violation that no subsequent political achievement could justify. Her death stands as evidence that even movements fighting for legitimate causes can lose moral authority when abandoning principles they claim to defend. Clara Petacci's execution reminds us that individual rights protection and human dignity must be maintained even when dealing with those associated with defeated and despised political movements. The questions that remain unanswered reflect broader problems with revolutionary justice administration during the war's final stages. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.